Hey, what's going on? Long time no see. I want to talk about test code a little bit and why your test code should not be dry. So if you haven't heard of dry before, it means do not repeat yourself. It's a really common thing in code. It's taught to junior developers. You should be trying to have a single source of truth for most of your information. That's good advice. Sometimes it can go overboard. But one place where it doesn't make a lot of sense is in tests. So today I'm going to talk about why your tests should not be dry. In fact, I want them to be dripping wet is what I said, right? Because it sounds disgusting, but I like that, dripping wet. Okay, so first of all, test code is never extended, right? So other, application level code, right? You're going to be remixing it. You're going to be changing things. You're going to be adding things, right? Changing variables, injecting things into other things. You should not be doing that with test code, right? Like there's never a place where you're going to take your test and then you're going to pass that as a callback to something else or something like that, right? So because your code is never extended, it doesn't need to be dry, right? The other thing is that the way you read test code is actually different than the way you read application code. And I'll get into that a little bit here. So let's take a look. Okay, so I wrote a very simple class. This is PHP, but this is language agnostic, right? So I made a really simple class, which is called array helper. Useless class, but it makes for a good example. So it takes in an array, okay, and then it has a few methods on it, right? So it has the contains method, so you can see if an item is in the array. It has a count method to get the count of the array. You can check if the array is empty. You can check if the array has duplicates, and then you can add an item to the array, right? Can't pop one, we didn't add that. Okay, pretty simple. And I'm going to show you two different ways to test this. There's a wet way and a dry way. We're going to start off with the dry way. Okay, here's my dry test. I'm going to go through explaining why people write code like this, and then why this is a bad way to write tests. So the very first thing here, I have a setup method. So this is PHP unit specific, but probably in any language they have this. This is a method that's going to run before your test. Okay, I'm going to make the argument you should not be using these methods, probably ever, right? There may be a few edge cases. You probably don't want to use a setup method, right? Some kind of method that runs before your actual test runs. So let's look what I'm doing in this setup method. I'm making an array, right? And I'm setting it as an instance variable, right? So it's an array, banana, apple, pear. Then I'm constructing an array helper, and I'm also setting that array helper as an instance variable. So now I have access to this array and this array helper in all of my tests. Okay, so we are going to look at our first test here. Test contains. Look how simple this test looks if you're just looking at this naively. It's 2 lines, right? So assert true, this array helper contains this array 0. Okay, assert false, this array helper contains not in array value. So if you look at this, this is super condensed. I haven't repeated myself. And in fact, if I were to change this to mango, right, it's still gonna work, right? So I've really dried up my test, right? So my test function will now work even if I change the setup details. Isn't that perfect, right? And that's kind of the thought process that people probably have when they're writing this kind of test. Same thing goes on down here, like test count, right? Assert count is the same as the array count, right? So array helper count is the same as the array count. Beautiful, isn't that so simple? And this whole thing is only 56 lines. It's 56 lines. It's more durable. If I change things, it'll still keep working in the setup. Wow, perfect. But this is not good. So let's take a look at the wet test, and then this might explain to you why I think this is a little bit better. Okay, so just looking here, I have 2 separate tests for the contains methods here, and that's a total of 16 lines, right? And in the dry test here, I have a total of 5 lines to test the exact same thing. So you might think, well, that's way better. It's a lot shorter. Think about how you would actually, though, deal with when do you actually deal with your test code? You deal with your test code when things are failing, when something's failing, right? So imagine you are a developer working on a team and you have to jump into some test code and take a look at it and figure out why this test is failing. Okay, so you get an alert saying that line 18, assert true, but we got false or something. Okay. If I look at this test, I can look here and say, okay, here's the array, here's the array helper, and this is the method that we're checking. And I can look here, it knows if the array contains an item. And it's all super verbose, but super clear, right? Not dry, super clear. I've got the word banana there twice. See, banana, banana. If I misspelled this here right like that, test is gonna fail. So it's not dry, super easy to read. However, let's say I got a message saying test contains fails, line 23. What do you have to do to actually figure out why this thing is failing? You actually have to now become the computer yourself and sort of compile this program. So you'll go, okay, this assert true, this array helper. What do you mean array helper? There's no array helper. Oh, there's a setup method. Let me jump up here. Okay, what's happening in the setup method? I'm making an array. I'm making an array helper. Okay, so now I've got these two things combined or compiled in my head. Okay, great. This contains this array 0. Okay, let me go back up here. Banana. Okay, great. Banana. Yes, it should pass. Okay, why isn't it passing? Okay, that is what you actually end up doing with these kind of dry tests. You compile the whole thing in your head. Again, with the wet test, you don't do that. You can just read it and go, okay, here's the array, banana. Oh, it contains banana. That's how this thing's supposed to work. Oh, here I don't have apple. Assert false contains apple. Super easy to read. Okay, now my wet array helper test is 94 lines long. Okay, my dry test is 56. It's much, much shorter, right? I have individual tests for the false and the positive things here, right? So I have array contains duplicates, array does not contain duplicates. This is much, much more verbose. I agree with that 100%, but also super, super easy to understand when you come in to fix a test. And that's what you're going to be mostly doing with your test code. If you are ever in a situation where you're grabbing this function and using it in a callback, something's gone really wrong with your tests. Okay, so that's basically it. So just as a general rule, you want to make your tests as easy to read in the moment, right, with this little brain compilation happening as possible. So if you're working in a different language, maybe you're working in Ruby and you've got that weird let thing, right, where it just sort of makes things if they don't exist or whatever, stop using that. It's harder for people to understand what's actually happening, right? You want them to be able to look at the test and it to be stupid simple to figure out what the test is supposed to do. And one possible criticism I might get is somebody saying like, okay, well, yeah, your setup method is really, really easy. So for you, that's simple. My setup method is 20 lines long. My setup method is so long. I'm not going to have that in every single test. It always does the exact same thing. Well, first of all, I'd say, does it always do the exact same thing? Or in some of your tests, does it do more than it actually needs to? In which case, it probably shouldn't be doing that, right? You're writing a weird test. The second thing is, if you really need to do stuff that you have to do in every single test, don't use the setup method. Because then, like if I'm down here and I'm trying to figure out what's going on here, I don't know there's a setup method. I've just jumped to line 87. Do I have to go back up and look at, for some setup method? Yeah, but so like if I'm down here on line, like 89, right? And I need something to actually happen, you can actually just write something, this like do thing or whatever setup thing you're going to want to do. Then at least the person who's reading this will go and say, okay, this do thing, oh, it does thing. At least I know that. Whereas if you just do setup, like nobody has any idea that that's happening. They can't figure out what's going on. They have to go up here, right? Heaven forbid you're extending a test case that is doing some kind of setup, and then you have to figure out like what is actually happening. Where's this coming from? Okay, that's it. I went on too long for that, but yeah, just kind of think about it. Dry's great. Sometimes it's really terrible. Dripping wet tests.